Uh-oh, okay, not supposed to go backward. Um, and so originally I'm from Central Illinois, hog, corn, soybean farm. Somebody told me recently that a few decades ago, if you were from another state, they used to call you a foreigner. Does anyone remember that? Yeah. And sometimes when I talk about risk management here, I feel like a foreigner. Now, when I was growing up in Illinois, the summer of '88, I remember when our grass turned brown during the drought. That was pretty rare for us. That was scary. Or around 2000 when crop prices got low. My parents told me things weren't looking very good. That was pretty scary too. That kind of hits you in the gut. Studied risk since then. But since I moved here, when you hear the stories about what happens to cows after a wildfire, watching this drought play out, or just sitting and analyzing crop yields in Kansas, really gives me a lot of respect for what you all do every day. So I'm going to start this talk out talking about risk management generally. I might use slightly different terms, but I think a lot of the content's going to be familiar to you and help you see where you fit in. I'm going to be talking about forage insurance as well, some different products there, how they work. And what I want you to take home from that is what makes sense for your operation. I don't work for the government. I don't sell crop insurance. What I want to do is I want to give you information that you can use to manage risk if it works best for your operation. So first of all, some terminology. A lot of times you hear about risk and uncertainty, and they're used interchangeably or as the same thing. And sometimes that's fine, but when you talk about an uncertain situation, you know that different things can happen. But one way to distinguish is that it can't be measured. So if you think about making breeding decisions for cows, it could be 1.5 or 2 years before you see any income. And who knows what's going to happen to markets in 1 or 2 years, especially 1.5, 2 years out. Measure. You can't use the futures market then. That's what I would call a very uncertain situation. And then there's risk. This is where there's some possibility that you could have a loss or some kind of difficult situation. However, measure the likelihood of a loss. So if you think about by the time your calves are born, there's future markets for feeder cattle. So if you go 6 months, a year out, you might have some idea of what the markets are going to be like. So why does measurement matter? Well, just in terms of management, it's easier to make a decision when you have some idea of the likelihood of a loss. Also, when you can measure risk, there's a possibility that you can outsource your risk. You can use products like insurance or hedging, and we're going to get to that. So there's a lot of sources of risk. Sometimes you'll hear about legal risk, human risk. In terms of producing livestock or cattle, production risk. So can you keep your animals healthy? Can you keep them alive? You can think about disease, natural disaster. Then there's feed risk. Is feed available or is it affordable? And you get through both of those, you still face price risk. So what if prices drop right before you take your animals to the market? So a lot of risk. So how do you think about risk? What's the objective of risk management? It can be different for different operations. You want to be able to stay in operation for another year. You want to mitigate or minimize the impact of losses. Now, this can look different across different operations. Sometimes that means you don't have to spend too much. You can keep your costs down. Sometimes it might mean minimizing the loss of income at the end of the year. If you have a beginning operation or you're an operation that's looking to expand or make new investments, you have to repay loans, you want to make sure that you can do that. So especially important if you're working with lenders. These are sometimes things that they're not mutually exclusive, so you could be working with different objectives. So the one thing I didn't say, can't go back, here is profit. So sometimes when you think about managing and risk and managing profit, it may work hand in hand, it may work together, and sometimes it's going to be a little bit different. So think about risk management. What are the potential losses? How could things go wrong? A lot of different ways. And then, how much of that can I handle? How much of it can I manage through? And what could I do right now to minimize the impact of any potential loss? I mean, whether it's a production risk, feed risk, market risk, what action can you take? Again, sometimes it's going to work hand in hand. So what choices could I do to make more money? But sometimes a lot of times in terms of risk management, you might be willing to pay a little bit more up front or accept lower income to be able to handle losses, to be able to handle bad outcomes. There's a lot of different approaches that farms take, ranches take. I like to think of it self-insurance, management, or outsourcing. So self-insurance is what I hear about a lot here. Also management, and this is what I would call outsourcing. We'll go through each of these. So sometimes people will tell me I don't manage risk, and I think what they usually mean is self-insurance. A lot of people tell me they self-insure. And a lot of this is managing risk through your bank account. And this can look different depending on operations. You may have off-farm income. So job in town, it may be the whole family, maybe a spouse. Or you could have different sources of income on your farm operations. You might have crops, energy production, a lot of different ways, but the idea here is that maybe you're not managing feed or production risk directly, but through other sources of income, you can manage through it. Next, managing your production. There's so many different ways. I just have 2 examples up here. First of all, if you vaccinate. So you want to prevent disease loss. You may not be sure whether or not something's going to happen, but you'll vaccinate to potentially prevent those losses. You can think about it in breeding decisions. I probably need to get a better picture here, but you may use sort of drought-resistant breeds that are more drought tolerant. Productivity may be a little bit lower, but might be easier to manage drought. Dustin talked about some of these as well. So topics we've covered. What about managing drought, the risk of drought? So you can store a lot of hay. That's not free. There's going to be some quality loss. But imagine this year if you'd stored a lot of hay. That's going to help a lot. Some producers might manage drought risk through lowering their selling cattle, so selling cows, early weaning. Again, these are things that we've been talking about. But there's a lot of different levers to manage drought risk. Some are bigger, some are more small changes. But they definitely have costs. Marketing is another way to manage risk, especially price risk. A lot of different ways to do this. You might be marketing throughout the year, so you're not going to sell all your calves at the same time. You might have flexibility on when you market, depending on conditions, depending on prices. Also use of contracts, and these can be very formal or informal, so you might have some type of special agreement with a local feed yard, a local processor, You might have a formal written contract. You might sell into premium or niche markets, so selling breeding stock, direct to consumers. So a lot of different options on the marketing side. I haven't seen one formula that works for everybody, but I've seen a lot of creativity in this area to manage price and market risk. Next, hedging. So now we're getting to where you can outsource your risk. What hedging does, using futures or options. So this is where you're able to protect against a decline in market prices. So you know what prices are sometime in the future, so you can protect yourself against them getting worse. So specifically, if you use futures, that sets a specific price or margin based on a specific date that you want to sell at in the future. So if you're calving in the spring, selling feeder cattle in the fall, you can use that to lock in or set a specific price. If you want to have an options contract, similar, but you're going to pay a premium, and instead of having a set price, you're going to have a minimum price. So why businesses do this? Well, the first one, the basic definition, you're going to protect against prices declining, things getting worse. If you know about potential profits in the future, you're able to better make informed business decisions. So let's say you have to buy some feed or buy some hay to feed calves. In today's environment, do you know whether or not you're going to make a profit? Well, you could use futures markets to manage that. Sometimes you might think the market is wrong. That's a bit trickier, but people will do it. So if you think prices are going to go down or up, you could use this as a tool. Generally with hedging, it doesn't work for all operations, or there's some concerns. So with futures, you have to create a margin account. You might get a margin call. So you have to have a good relationship with your lender and have a plan for this. If you want to use options, there's a premium you have to pay up front, which if there's a lot of risk in the market, that's going to cost more. That's a concern. There's also commission, so you have to pay somebody to do it for you. Last part is contract size. So if you want to do a futures or options contracts, those are in increments of 50,000 pounds. So if you're a small producer, this may be a barrier. So for larger feedlots, it might not be such an issue, but there are some trade-offs with these tools. So next, we're moving into insurance or the government. I teach ag policy, and so when we talk about the government's role in insurance, we use this term, the Federal Farm Safety Net. So what is this? My students sometimes complain that there's too many acronyms. So if you ever worked with your local FSA office, hopefully some of these look familiar. Livestock forage program, I think most counties would have been eligible for payouts if you had cattle or other livestock to help you manage forage costs. But there's insurance programs for crops, a lot of different products. So there's various payments that provide risk protection or financial support. So how important is this? Well, for crop farmers, especially, historically, it's been pretty important. So this chart, you go back to 1996, all the way to 2021. The blue, that's net farm income, so income from crop and livestock production. The orange, those are government payments. These don't include any crop insurance indemnities. But you go back to 2000, 2002, government payments were pretty important, part of farm income in the state of Kansas.
What happened in those years? I was in college. I don't
know. Me too. Crop prices went really low. You had the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s. So there was freedom to farm in 1996. They were going to get away from price supports, but then you had huge price crashes and low farm income in the late 90s. So there was a lot of ad hoc payments during that time. And you come up here, sort of lower income years, 2015 through 18. You had the trade war here, COVID pandemic. So some years a safety net is pretty important. And in recent years, more of these payments have been for livestock producers. MFP, CFAP, more acronyms, the trade-related payments, COVID pandemic-related payouts. But I'm specifically going to talk about forage insurance. This is a part of the federal crop insurance program. Corn, beans, wheat, probably some regular business decision. I think some 90% corn, soybean, most row crop acres in Kansas and other states are going to use crop insurance. It may not even be something you think about very much. This is what's called a private-public partnership. So the government is paying for part of the cost of this, but you don't go to your FSA office. You go to an independent insurance agent. And they're the ones that are going to really help you understand it. Now, it is called the Federal Crop Insurance Program, but there are a lot of insurance products that are available for livestock producers. Some of these are relatively new. Some of them have been around for a while, and they're growing. But part of the work that I do in this space is to make sure that livestock producers in Kansas are aware of their options here. So before I get into my definition, I have some quotes from real producers. Now, this is from Twitter. I think they sound real. I think they are real, but I can't guarantee it. But I thought sort of a conversation about, I think that basically that it was a grain producer in western Kansas that had been using crop insurance, going through a drought, would have preferred, but this year crop insurance was going to make a big difference. This first one, so I talked about outsourcing risk. You do that in terms of hedging. Really, this is sharing the risk with the public or the taxpayer. So that's one way to look at it. In turn for producing food, you share the risk with the public. And then these last two. Cattle are a loss and then some. I wish cattle had a safety net. While there is a safety net for cattle, again, it's smaller, it's starting from a smaller base, it's still growing, people aren't as aware of it. So before I talked about, with risk, you can measure the likelihood of different outcomes. If you can do that, you can outsource risk with insurance. So this becomes important for livestock and forage. If you think of crop yields, those are easy to measure and they're consistently measured. So when I teach ag policy, I ask my students, what's the APH? What's your yield for livestock or forage? They do rate of gain, bales of hay, weight gain, number of calves, tonnage. So there are measurements, but they're not as easy to measure and as consistently measured as crop yields. So it's a little bit trickier to develop insurance products for forage or for livestock production. You can do it, but it looks a little bit different than insuring crop yields or crop revenue. So two major livestock insurance options that are more widely used right now. There's other ones as well. I have a link there. I go through all of them. But livestock risk protection, that's price insurance. That's based on futures markets. Futures markets, by definition, they're easy to measure. The other one, that's what I'm going to talk about here, is pasture, rangeland, and forage. And this is rainfall, or technically precipitation insurance. So before I get into details first, is there anybody here that works in insurance? Okay. Also, right, if you're comfortable sharing, I'd like to get an idea of where people are with this. Again, this is voluntary, but is there anybody who's never heard of this or isn't very familiar with it? Have most of you heard of PRF insurance? Is there anybody here that's used it? Okay. So I'm guessing there's some of you that are less familiar and some of you that have used it. So as I go through this, hopefully you can share a little bit and help everybody come to a common understanding. I'm going to start from the basics and build up. So first of all, what does insurance do? You know, one of the ways we talk about it makes you whole. So you're going to lose some of your income for whatever reason, and it's going to replace some of that. So it's going to protect your business, it's going to protect your farm or ranch. It's also going to help you make decisions for your business. So a couple terms here. Again, if you're not familiar, especially if you're not familiar with crop insurance, coverage level and guarantee your liability. So a coverage level, if you think about the deductible, so if you buy insurance for your car, you're going to have a deductible. And you can think of it's the opposite of a deductible. If you have a high deductible, you have to have a large loss before you get a payment. If you have a high coverage level with crop insurance or livestock insurance, that means you're protecting more of your income. So a high coverage level means you have to have a smaller loss before you get a payment. We'll get into that. The other term is guarantee your liabilities. So think about you're insuring your car. You have to have an estimate of how much your car is worth. Same thing for livestock insurance. You have to have an estimate of how much your cattle are worth, how much your forage is worth. And that's going to be called your guarantee your liabilities. That's going to be based on that. So I'd like to take this a little bit further to insurance terms hopefully everyone is familiar with. So forage insurance, that's going to protect against low precipitation. If you get car insurance, that's protecting against something that's relatively unlikely. So hopefully you're not getting in a car accident as often as you don't have enough rain. That you probably wouldn't be able to get insurance if that were the case. Next, what about the cost? So forage insurance, the federal government's going to pay part, but not all of the cost. So the producer has skin in the game with this. If you buy regular insurance, it's out of pocket. Other thing with forage insurance and other crop insurance and livestock insurance products, you don't pay when you buy it. For forage insurance, it's not about 9 months after enrollment. Sometimes it's even later than that. With regular insurance, you're going to usually have to pay right away or within a month or two at least. Okay. So pasture, rangeland, and forage insurance, what is it? So if there's one thing you're going to remember, this is it. You have pasture or hay acreage, and it's drier than usual in your area, you get paid. So that's the take home with this. And we're going to break down each part of this. So first of all, it's going to cover perennial hay crops or land that's used for grazing. Now there is something called annual forage insurance, which is almost like PRF, but it's for annually grown forage or feed crops. I think, well, PRF is much more widely used. So if you understand PRF, annual forage is pretty easy to understand. I do have slides on it at the end, and I can talk about it more. Next, it covers drier conditions. So sometimes it's referred to as rainfall insurance or covering rain. And part of that, I think, is because rain is easier to say than precipitation. But whether it's rain or snow, it's going to cover either of those. Next, it's in your area. It's not what happens on your land. It's in your area, or the term is a grid. So if you see, that's where we are here. That's the Nebraska border. That's the Colorado border. So usually you're going to have a couple grids within a county. So what is the practical implications of this? So rainfall or precipitation is going to be estimated at the grid level. So there can be cases where, let's say you're down here, and there's less rainfall in most of your grid, but you're fine. So you could get a payment even though you were okay. The opposite could happen as well. Let's say you're in a particularly dry area of your grid, but there's a lot of rainfall in other parts. So that can happen. That's a risk you need to understand. I will say, though, when you talk about droughts like this year, that's less relevant. When it's dry everywhere, it's less of an issue of what happens relative to the grid. Can everybody see this okay? All right. So we talked about less precipitation than normal. So I'm not going to be talking in terms of inches. But I'm going to be talking about it in terms of percent. So you can think of 100, that's the historic average precipitation within a 2-month interval. And so we're going to think, I think it's most helpful to think about it in percent. So 75, that's 75% of the historic average. And this is going to be throughout the year in 2-month intervals. We'll get back into that, but think about this, January or February, so 53. So that's 53% of normal for that period. July and August, 102. So that's about average. It still might have been pretty dry. So if you have months that are typically already very dry, it's going to have to be even more drier to trigger an indemnity. September and October of 2022, that's the latest measurement. That was about 50% or half of the historic average. We'll get back to that. So you're looking at less precipitation than usual. And this is I'd say one of the trickier parts of PRF, especially if you're starting on it. You're deciding what time of the year you get protection, when you want to use it. And you have to cover at least 4 months. And you have to decide how important each month is. So really this is something where you sit down with an agent and you work it out. Hopefully I can give you enough information here that you understand that choice. But different ways to do this. You might cover spring and summer when rainfall is the most important for you. In some cases, producers will select winter months. Winter months tend to have higher premiums and a much higher likelihood of indemnities. So some people are using those. You can also cover the entire year. And if it's a higher weight, that means that you're going to pay higher premiums, and if there's lower rainfall, you get higher payouts. So it's a little tricky. It's something where you really have to sit down and figure it out. But the key point is the producer picks when they use it and how important it is within the calendar year. Now, the next part, you get payouts, you get paid. It's going to be automatic. So there's no loss adjustment. USDA is estimating rainfall at the grid level. And so when you get paid is if the actual precipitation, and that's the index, is going to be lower than the producer selected coverage level. The coverage level, that's like the opposite of a deductible. So that goes from 70 to 90%. So if you pick 90%, the actual index is less than 90%, you get a payout. So higher coverage levels, they're going to pay out more frequently. They're going to cost more. For lower, it's the opposite. They cost less and they pay out less. You get what you pay for with this. So if we want to revisit this again, so 2022, the September, October would have paid out for all policies, or any policies that covered this interval. Same for August, September. June, July, and August would not have paid out, really close to average. But most, except for the lower coverage policies, earlier in the year would have been paying out. And I'll go through some more examples on that. So this is available, this information is available online for 20 years. And some insurance agents are going to have different programs where they can show you this. So you can sit down and look at this and think about, your own experience if you're keeping rainfall records even. Look at patterns in your area. A lot of information is available. So just to reiterate, when do you get paid? So let's say you pick a 90% coverage level. The actual index is 85, so rainfall is 85% of normal. So then you're going to get an indemnity. However, if you picked 80% and your actual precipitation is 85, you don't get a payout because it was higher than your coverage level. If the actual precipitation index is above 100, or I guess even above 90, it's never going to pay out. It's not covering wet conditions. You had at least as much or more rainfall than you would have historically. So how much do you get paid? We get back to the guarantee of liabilities. So the level of payout is going to be based on an estimate of the returns to grazing or hay production in your county. So that's going to be a county average measure. You can adjust that, but our 2023 returns to alfalfa, so this is for this year under current hay prices, are $488 per acre. I think that's double last year. And I want you to keep that number in mind as we go through this. I'm going to return to it. So how much you get paid, there's this measure of county average hay returns or returns to grazing. Returns to grazing, you can think of them like a rent, a little higher than that. However, you are able to adjust this up or down. So if the number seems too low or too high, it is a lever. Oh, I did it again. Sorry, Sandy. So the term for that is a productivity factor. Okay. Last time. Okay. So what matters for how you get paid? You can't control actual precipitation. That's why you're getting insurance in the first place. And you can't control the county base value, but you pick your coverage level. So how much precipitation needs to drop. You pick your productivity factor, and then you pick the point within the year when you have coverage. So a lot of things that you really have to sit down and figure out. More details in the slides if you want it. So what did 2022 look like? So I did 90% for hay in Cheyenne County. These numbers are going to be higher than for grazing, but the patterns are going to be the same. So the weight was equal throughout the year, so I assume that a producer was covering every interval about equally weighted. The premium would have been $18 per acre. I think grazing would have been $2. And the indemnity to date, so this is the actual index, pretty low in the spring and again in the fall. So indemnities to date without November and December would have been $43 relative to that. This is the producer premium, so that's the producer share, it's not the actual cost. So, I mean, this is sort of what you'd expect in a year with the drought we're facing. But pretty substantial payouts. It was $2 premium versus $8 indemnity for grazing. So you'd have about $6 per acre that you'd be ahead this year. 2021's in there for a reference. The deadline is December 1st. If you're interested in annual forage, that's July 15th. Again, annual forage is almost like PRF. It's just for annually planted crops. So what about the management considerations for this? The cost, I've seen it go from $1 to $25 per acre. So that's the different choices a producer can make, whether you can do hay or grazing. It's very customizable. Next, risk reduction. So part of that's about figuring out when do you most need rain? Also, are you comfortable with the grid? The other one is, and I think almost all insurance agents I've talked to will tell you this, and I've looked at the data a lot, it's consistent, and as well as research. Payouts and premiums are going to be higher during the winter. So is that a tool that you want to use? This last one that I've been encouraging, and I have heard that some producers do this, that considering PRF as a drought savings account. Two reasons for this. So one, I said, what's the returns to alfalfa for 2023? $488 an acre. That's a lot. That's because we have really high hay prices right now. The PRF coverage is based on average hay prices. So, if you want to be able to use this to manage your forage costs, you're going to need more during a drought year. The other reason I encourage people to consider it like a drought savings account is, because it's based off of the grid, because it's not perfectly matched to what happens on your operation, thinking about it like a savings account, yeah, it might not always match your situation, but over time, because of the cost share with the federal government, you should end up with some money, more indemnities and premiums. And that's a tool you can use, whether for buying forage, replacement, family living, whatever your objectives are. So to summarize, there are forage products that protect against dry conditions. Producers are likely to come out ahead in the long run. If you're just getting started, there's some areas that it's going to take some time to figure out. You're going to want to find an insurance agent that's going to sit down and work through this with you. Last of all, I want everyone, and something I really try to be clear about, other speakers here are talking about different ways you can manage your operation, you can manage through drought. Insurance doesn't substitute for that, it complements that. For some farms, this might be a way to protect your investments, to protect your operation, to protect your family. And with that, I'm happy to take questions. I could also talk over lunch if someone's interested. Oh, I did it again. I'm done.
Just curious,
yeah.
How many people in here use the annual forage insurance? Or knew about it before this? That was an option?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The key difference is you have to pick a growing season that matches when you're growing that crop. So instead of having the whole year, your coverage has to match when the crop is growing. And there's also something you'd want to talk to an insurance agent about, but you have a bit of flexibility if you decide not to use that crop for forage. You can basically cancel your coverage. It won't attach. And that's sort of later within the period. But again, that's something that gets into the details, into the weeds that you can talk with an agent. But there is some flexibility with it.
More questions?
All right. Yeah.
Okay. Well, keep close on time. Thank you,
Yep. This is so I'm working with some researchers from other places, and we're doing a survey on crop insurance. So if you've raised corn within the past couple of years, you're eligible to take this. There is substantial payment. So $50 to $99, it's going to average 71. It's going to take about half an hour. And it is a little bit more involved than some surveys. But it only takes half an hour, and we do compensate you if you're interested, and this is in your slides.